The decline of the old world. Something has gone badly wrong with the European economy. And most people haven't fully grasped how serious it is. A generation ago, Western Europe represented the pinnacle of economic achievement. High wages, strong manufacturing, generous social benefits, and a quality of life that was the envy of the world. The combined output of European Union member states rivaled that of the United States. In many respects, Europeans lived better than Americans. Shorter work weeks, longer vacations, universal health care, excellent public transportation. The European model seemed like the future that other nations would eventually follow. That future never arrived. Instead, something closer to the opposite happened. While the American economy nearly doubled in size over the past 17 years, Europe's growth has been almost invisible. The United States added more economic output in the past decade than the entire European Union produces in a year. Countries that once manufactured products for the global market are now watching their factories close and their skilled workers emigrate to better opportunities elsewhere. Young people with talent and ambition increasingly see their futures outside the continent rather than within it. Investment money that used to flow into European businesses now routes through New York and Silicon Valley instead. This decline stems from 6 interconnected failures that have been building for decades. European industry is losing its competitive edge as energy costs spiral upward to levels that make manufacturing uneconomical. Birth rates have collapsed so severely that pension systems face mathematical impossibility within the coming decades. The technology sector that drives modern economies barely exists on the continent in any meaningful form. Capital markets remain fragmented and underdeveloped compared to American alternatives. Energy policy has backfired catastrophically in ways that few anticipated. And military neglect has left the continent dependent on outside protection at the worst possible moment in recent history. Each of these problems reinforces the others in ways that accelerate the overall decline. Shrinking populations mean fewer workers to staff factories and fewer consumers to buy products. Expensive energy drives manufacturers to relocate production to other continents where operating costs are more reasonable. Weak capital markets starve, promising startups of the funding they need to grow into global competitors. Regulatory burdens push successful companies to establish headquarters elsewhere. The result is a slow but steady drain of economic vitality that compounds with each passing year and shows no signs of reversing. What follows is an examination of how each of these 6 wounds developed, why European leaders failed to address them when intervention might have helped, and what the consequences may be if current trends continue along their present trajectory. The Great Deindustrialization. Germany built its wealth on a simple bargain with the world. It would make things high-quality things and sell them to anyone willing to pay. Automobiles, industrial chemicals, precision machinery, factory equipment, for generations. The label "Made in Germany" commanded premium prices and symbolized reliability that customers around the world trusted without hesitation. This manufacturing dominance rested on a foundation that few questioned until recently. Russian pipelines delivered natural gas at prices far below what competitors in other regions paid for equivalent energy supplies. Asian markets, particularly China, absorbed enormous quantities of German exports and seemed eager to purchase even more. And security commitments from the United States meant Berlin could direct government spending toward economic development rather than military hardware and defense infrastructure. The invasion of Ukraine shattered this arrangement almost overnight. Energy supplies that German industry had treated as permanent suddenly vanished from the equation entirely. Factories that had operated profitably for decades found themselves paying several times more for electricity than competitors in North America or Asia were paying for identical power. The math stopped working for businesses that had never imagined such a scenario. Corporate responses to this new reality have been swift and alarming for anyone paying attention. Major chemical manufacturers have announced plans to shift production to other continents where energy remains affordable. One of the largest has committed billions to constructing new facilities in Asia rather than expanding its historic German operations that employed thousands of workers. When companies that helped build the German economic miracle conclude they can no longer afford to operate there, something fundamental has broken in the system. The policy response has been contradictory at best and self-defeating at worst. Authorities phased out nuclear generating stations during the same period they were desperately searching for alternatives to Russian energy imports, to keep electricity flowing to homes and businesses. Operators brought aging coal facilities back online and expanded extraction of low-grade fossil fuels that produce more pollution per unit of energy than almost any alternative. Environmental goals that motivated the nuclear phase-out have been undermined by increased coal consumption that shows no sign of ending soon. Manufacturing employment continues to decline across the continent as companies make difficult decisions about where to locate future operations. Factories that once supported entire communities are scaling back shifts or closing altogether and relocating to friendlier jurisdictions. The industrial base that powered European prosperity for over a century is eroding steadily, and nothing obvious has emerged to replace the jobs and tax revenue being lost. The demographic death spiral: factories can be rebuilt and energy sources can be replaced, but a population collapse cannot be reversed quickly under any circumstances. Europe is experiencing one of the most severe demographic contractions in modern history, and the consequences will reshape the continent for generations to come. Across the continent, women are having fewer children than at any point since records began being collected systematically. Spain, Greece, Poland, and several other nations have fertility rates hovering around 1.2 or 1.3 children per woman throughout her lifetime. These numbers sit far below what demographers consider necessary to maintain a stable population over time, without relying on external sources of new residents, without sustained immigration at levels that would dramatically change the cultural composition of these societies. The population of several European countries will shrink by double-digit percentages before the end of this century. The economic implications are devastating for systems built on entirely different assumptions about how many workers would exist. European welfare states were constructed during an era of abundant workers and relatively few retirees collecting benefits simultaneously. Social insurance programs assumed that large numbers of young, employed citizens would always be available to fund benefits for a smaller population of elderly recipients who had paid into the system during their working years. Those assumptions have been demolished by demographic reality that nobody adequately prepared for. Consider the burden facing workers in Southern Europe today as they attempt to build their own lives. Government pension obligations consume enormous portions of national budgets that might otherwise fund infrastructure or education. Healthcare costs rise steadily as populations age and require more medical intervention and long-term care services. Yet the number of working-age adults paying into these systems shrinks every single year. As older workers retire and younger cohorts fail to replace them in sufficient numbers, the workers who remain face mounting pressure to fund promises made to previous generations. Promises that grow more expensive with each passing year and show no sign of becoming more affordable. Many young professionals have responded by emigrating to countries with better economic prospects and lower tax burdens. Nations with stagnant economies and crushing fiscal obligations watch their most educated citizens relocate to places offering better opportunities and the chance to actually build wealth over a career. This outflow removes precisely the people who might otherwise contribute most to domestic tax revenues and economic growth. Those left behind shoulder an even heavier load as a result, which encourages further emigration and deepens the crisis in a self-reinforcing cycle. The political dynamics make meaningful reform nearly impossible to achieve through normal democratic processes. Pensioners vote in large numbers and reliably punish any party that threatens their benefits at the ballot box with electoral defeat. Proposals to address the worker shortage through large-scale immigration generate fierce opposition from voters concerned about cultural change and national identity. Leaders who acknowledge the severity of the crisis publicly risk electoral defeat from multiple directions simultaneously. So governments borrow to cover deficits year after year, accumulating debts that future generations of an ever smaller workforce will somehow need to repay, despite having even fewer resources available. The innovation vacuum the industries driving global economic growth in the 21st century are overwhelmingly digital, and Europe has failed to build competitive players in almost any of them, despite having access to world-class talent and substantial financial resources. Mobile communications technology was actually pioneered on the continent by engineers and companies that once led the world in this critical sector. But European companies lost their positions entirely when the industry shifted to smartphones and app ecosystems that rewarded different capabilities than those European firms had developed. The search engines that billions of people use daily to navigate the internet were developed in America by entrepreneurs who built global monopolies from scratch. Social networks where much of modern public discourse takes place are headquartered in California and Texas, rather than London or Berlin. Cloud infrastructure that powers businesses worldwide runs primarily through data centers owned by a handful of American corporations that have invested hundreds of billions in these facilities. The artificial intelligence systems generating enormous excitement and investment originate almost exclusively from American and Chinese research labs that attract the best minds from everywhere, including Europe itself. This absence from leading technology sectors carries enormous economic consequences that compound over time. Profits generated by digital platforms flow to shareholders and employees concentrated in a small number of American cities that have become extraordinarily wealthy as a result. Tax revenues follow the same pattern and fund public services in those communities rather than European ones. European consumers and businesses pay subscription fees and advertising costs that enrich companies with minimal physical presence on the continent and limited commitment to European economic success. The structural barriers facing European technology entrepreneurs are substantial and have been well documented by researchers and practitioners alike. Building a company that serves the entire American market requires dealing with one set of federal regulations, one dominant language, and broadly similar business practices from coast to coast that make scaling relatively straightforward. Building a company that serves the European market means confronting dozens of separate legal jurisdictions with different requirements, multiple official languages that require translation and localization, and regulatory frameworks that differ significantly from one country to the next in ways that create constant friction. The time and capital consumed by crossing each internal border could otherwise be deployed toward product development and market expansion that would help European companies compete globally. Successful European technology founders often face a difficult choice as their companies mature and require additional resources to reach the next level. Remaining independent requires competing against American giants with access to far deeper pools of investment capital and much larger markets that provide stable revenue bases. Accepting acquisition offers from those same giants provides liquidity for founders and resources for growth, but transfers ownership and strategic control overseas permanently. The pattern has repeated frequently enough that European technology development increasingly resembles a farm system that cultivates promising talent for eventual export to leagues where the real money gets made and the important decisions happen. Brussels has attempted to address this competitive disadvantage through regulation rather than cultivation of domestic champions. European lawmakers have produced extensive legislation governing how technology companies must operate, covering everything from data handling to market competition to content moderation. While these rules may serve legitimate policy objectives, they also consume resources that European startups can barely afford to spare, while American competitors treat compliance costs as minor inconveniences relative to their massive revenue streams. The capital flight Europe saves money, but fails to deploy it productively, and this disconnect helps explain why the continent keeps falling further behind economically. European households actually save at higher rates than American households in most years. The money exists. The problem is where it goes after being saved. A disproportionate share sits in low-yield bank deposits or gets locked into residential property that generates no productive economic activity beyond providing shelter. Very little finds its way into the equity of growing businesses that might create jobs and generate wealth over time. This pattern has deep cultural and historical roots that prove resistant to change. Stock market investments are viewed with suspicion across much of the continent, associated with speculation and instability rather than long-term wealth building. The memory of financial crises and currency collapses lingers across generations in ways that encourage hoarding over investing. Government policy often reinforces these tendencies through tax systems that favor real estate ownership and pension structures that discourage individual investment decisions. The practical result is that European businesses operate in a capital-scarce environment. Despite being surrounded by substantial aggregate wealth, Banks provide debt financing, but impose conditions that limit flexibility and growth potential. Equity investors exist, but remain far less numerous and less willing to accept risk than their counterparts elsewhere. Companies that need significant funding to scale operations frequently find that the path of least resistance leads outside the continent entirely. Financial infrastructure compounds these cultural factors in important ways. Stock exchanges in individual European countries remain fragmented rather than consolidated into a single liquid marketplace. Trading volumes pale in comparison to American equivalents, which means buying and selling shares costs more and moves prices further. Regulatory frameworks differ across jurisdictions in ways that create friction and uncertainty for investors attempting to operate across borders. The wealth that Europeans have accumulated over generations increasingly gets invested in faster-growing economies elsewhere. Retirement funds seek better returns abroad. Insurance companies diversify internationally. Family offices spread holdings across multiple continents. This exported capital fuels growth in other regions, while the European economy that generated it struggles to attract investment for its own development needs. The energy gamble gone wrong. Electricity prices determine which factories stay open and which ones close. And European electricity has become some of the most expensive in the developed world. The roots of this crisis stretch back long before any recent geopolitical events brought it into sharp focus. For years, policymakers across the continent made a series of decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation but combined to create extraordinary vulnerability. Baseload generating capacity was retired before adequate replacements came online. Domestic hydrocarbon resources were declared off-limits for extraction. Grid infrastructure was not upgraded to handle the variable output of new generating sources. Import dependency grew steadily without serious contingency planning for supply disruptions. When disruption finally arrived, the system had no resilience left to absorb the shock. Prices spiked to levels that seemed almost fictional compared to historical norms. Industrial facilities that had operated profitably for generations suddenly faced operating costs that exceeded their revenues. Some reduced output immediately, while others began planning permanent relocations to regions with more favorable energy economics. The damage extended beyond factory floors into ordinary households struggling to afford basic utilities. Families faced impossible choices about which necessities to prioritize when bills consumed portions of income that had previously gone toward food, clothing, and other essentials. Political pressure forced governments to intervene with emergency assistance programs funded by borrowing that added to already concerning debt levels. Perhaps most frustrating for those who supported ambitious environmental goals, the crisis actually set back progress on emissions reduction in several countries. Generating capacity that had been scheduled for retirement was kept running instead. Facilities that had been mothballed were brought back into service regardless of their environmental profile. The urgent need to keep lights on and homes warm overrode longer-term climate considerations. The path forward requires massive investment in new generating capacity, transmission infrastructure, and storage systems that can handle intermittent supply. These projects take years to plan, permit, and construct, even under favorable conditions. Meanwhile, businesses making location decisions today cannot wait for infrastructure that might arrive in the next decade. They need affordable energy now, and Europe cannot provide it. The geopolitical freeloader, military strength costs money, and Europe decided decades ago that it had better uses for its budget than maintaining serious armed forces. The calculation was never stated so bluntly in official documents, but the pattern of spending decisions made the priorities clear enough. When faced with choices between funding weapons systems or expanding public services, European governments consistently chose public services when confronted with aging equipment that needed replacement or renovation. They chose to delay procurement and extend the operational life of existing assets beyond reasonable limits. When alliance partners raised concerns about inadequate contributions to collective defense, they offered reassurances about future improvements that never quite materialized. This approach to national security rested on assumptions that proved dangerously optimistic. European leaders believed that large-scale conventional warfare had become obsolete on their continent. They trusted that diplomatic relationships and economic interdependence would prevent conflicts from escalating to the point where military force mattered. They assumed that if a genuine threat ever did emerge, there would be sufficient time to rebuild capabilities before any confrontation turned serious. These assumptions have collided violently with reality in recent years. Conflict has returned to European territory at a scale not seen in decades. The military resources available to respond have proven shockingly inadequate relative to the demands being placed on them. Stockpiles that were supposed to sustain operations for extended periods have been drawn down at rates that expose how thin the reserves actually were. Addressing these shortfalls requires redirecting substantial resources toward defense procurement and military readiness over an extended period. Factories capable of producing weapons and ammunition need to be built or reactivated after years of dormancy. Training programs need expansion to develop personnel capable of operating modern equipment effectively. All of this costs money that must come from somewhere in national budgets already stretched by existing commitments. The political difficulty of this transition should not be underestimated given what European voters have grown accustomed to expecting from their governments. Public services that took decades to build cannot easily be scaled back to free up funds for tanks and aircraft. Populations that have enjoyed extensive social benefits will resist losing them regardless of the strategic justification offered. Elected leaders face the unpleasant task of explaining why sacrifices are necessary after decades of assuring citizens that the world had moved beyond such concerns. To futures, the trajectory described in these chapters is not inevitable. But reversing it will require changes that European political systems have proven reluctant to deliver. Reform efforts have been proposed repeatedly over the past decade by economists, business leaders, and politicians willing to speak uncomfortable truths. Reports have been commissioned outlining exactly what needs to happen. The diagnosis is not mysterious among people who study these questions seriously. The obstacle is not a lack of understanding about what has gone wrong. The obstacle is that meaningful reform imposes costs on constituencies with substantial political power. Pensioners who vote reliably will resist any reduction in benefits they were promised. Workers in protected industries will oppose measures that expose them to international competition. Regions dependent on subsidies will fight to preserve funding streams, regardless of economic returns. Each group has legitimate concerns and democratic weight that cannot simply be overridden. Successful reform requires political leadership willing to spend enormous capital on unpopular decisions and electorates willing to accept short-term sacrifice for long-term benefit. Both have been in short supply for many years. Elections reward politicians who promise to protect existing arrangements rather than disrupt them. Voters punish leaders who deliver honest assessments rather than comfortable reassurances. The consequences of continued inaction will accumulate gradually, rather than arriving as a single catastrophic event. Each year, the relative position weakens slightly. Each year, the gap with faster-growing economies widens. Each year, talented individuals decide where to build their careers based on their assessment of where opportunities will be greatest. These choices aggregate into trends that become increasingly difficult to reverse. Previous generations transformed a war-devastated continent into one of the most prosperous regions in human history within decades. They built institutions and systems that delivered remarkable improvements for hundreds of millions of people. Whether current generations will summon similar determination remains an open question that only time will answer.